when it's on the page, and you have guys like Kurt Russell and Bill Paxton and Val Kilmer. The cast in that film alone, all of them, and a lot of them are gone today.
Sam Elliott once looked a screenwriter dead in the eye on the set of Tombstone, and told him that if a single word of his dialogue got cut, he would kill him. People who heard it laughed, because that is the kind of thing actors say when tempers run hot on a grueling location shoot. But underneath that gruff, half-joking threat was something far more serious, and it points to a secret about this movie that most fans who can quote every line have never actually pieced together. This is the story of how Tombstone nearly collapsed before it was even finished, how its biggest star secretly ran the production without ever putting his name on it, and how one actor refused to let the soul of his character be cut away to save time and money. By the time this is over, you will understand why Sam Elliott believed that Tombstone, the world fell in love with, is only part of the movie it was supposed to be. To understand what Elliott was protecting, you first need to understand how unlikely this film was in the first place. By 1993, the Western had been considered commercially dead for years. Studios had mostly walked away from the genre, treating it as a relic of an earlier era of Hollywood. Into that environment came a screenwriter named Kevin Jarre, who had already proven himself capable of handling large-scale, character-driven historical drama as the writer of the Civil War epic Glory. Jarre wrote a script for Tombstone that was sprawling, detailed, and deeply textured, the kind of screenplay that does not just tell a story but builds an entire world around it. That script was strong enough to pull together one of the most stacked casts of the decade. Kurt Russell signed on to play Wyatt Earp. Val Kilmer took the role of Doc Holliday, the part that would eventually define his career. Sam Elliott was cast as Virgil Earp, the older brother and the family's moral center. Bill Paxton played Morgan Earp. The supporting cast alone reads like a who's who of that era of Hollywood, including Powers Booth, Michael Biehn, Stephen Lang, Billy Zane, Jason Priestley, and Charlton Heston, with Robert Mitchum brought in to narrate the film. What most casual fans do not realize is that Jarre was not simply the writer on this project. He was also set to make his directorial debut with Tombstone. He was deeply committed to historical authenticity, down to demanding that the cast grow and style real period-accurate mustaches so the film would feel lived in rather than costumed. That obsessive attention to detail became part of what the cast loved about the project from the very beginning. They were not signing on for a standard studio western. They believed they were making something closer to a definitive historical epic, a film that would treat the story of the Earps and the OK Corral with the same seriousness and scope that Glory had brought to the Civil War. Unfortunately, writing a script like that and directing a production of that scale turned out to be two very different challenges. Jarre had never directed a film before, and the demands of managing horses, extras, gunfights, and a massive ensemble cast on a tight schedule proved overwhelming almost immediately. Reports from the production suggest he was trying to shoot in a slow, deliberate, painterly style reminiscent of a classic Western director like John Ford, but that pace could not survive the practical demands of a modern studio production with a ticking financial clock. Barely a month into filming, producer Andy Vajna made the difficult decision to remove Jarre from the director's chair entirely. That should have been the moment Tombstone fell apart completely. A production with no director, a half-finished script, a cast that had signed on to work under one specific creative vision, and a budget that was bleeding money by the day. Many films in this position simply collapse, get shelved, or turn into disasters that never see release. What happened next is where the real story most fans have never fully absorbed begins, and Sam Elliott was right in the middle of it. The studio brought in George P. Cosmatos to take over as director, a filmmaker known primarily for high-octane action movies like the second Rambo film and Cobra. 4 years, the official record of the film simply credited Cosmatos as the sole director, and that is still what appears on the poster and in the credits today. But the full story did not come out publicly until years later, when Kurt Russell gave an interview to True West magazine that reshaped how people understood the making of this film. According to Russell's account, he was the one who had personally secured a large portion of the roughly $25 million budget needed to keep the production financed in the first place. He had put his own reputation on the line to make sure the movie got made. So when the studio needed someone to step in and take control after Jarre was removed, Russell was the natural choice. But Russell did not want the director's credit. He did not want his name publicly attached to that role. Instead, according to his own account, he proposed a quieter solution, bringing Cosmatos as the public face of the production, while Russell worked behind the scenes every night, mapping out exactly what needed to be filmed the next day and handing that plan directly to Cosmatos. The arrangement, as Russell described it, meant that Cosmatos would step onto set each morning and direct scenes that had effectively already been planned out for him the night before. Russell reportedly made Cosmatos a personal promise that he would never speak publicly about the arrangement while Cosmatos was alive, and by most accounts he kept that promise for years. It was only after Cosmatos passed away in 2005 that Russell finally shared the full story in that 2006 interview. This detail matters enormously for understanding what happened next, because once Russell was effectively steering the production from behind the scenes, he had to make some brutal creative decisions, and those decisions are exactly what put him at odds with Sam Elliott. With the schedule in chaos and the budget shrinking, Russell was faced with a script that was simply too large and too expensive to shoot in the time that remained. So he began cutting. Working alongside producer James Jacks, Russell trimmed roughly 30 pages out of Jarre's original screenplay. Supporting characters who had been given substantial arcs on the page, including roles played by Billy Zane and Jason Priestley, were reduced significantly. The Earp Vendetta ride, which had been written as a much larger, more detailed sequence in the original script, was compressed down into something closer to a montage in the final film. Russell's stated reasoning, according to his later interviews, was that the film needed one clear emotional through line to hold everything together, and he chose to build that through line around the friendship between Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. To sharpen that relationship and give it room to breathe, nearly everything else in the script had to shrink around it. To his credit, Russell did not spare his own role from these cuts. By most accounts of the production, he actively pushed to give lines away from his own character to other members of the ensemble, insisting that the film needed to feel like a true ensemble piece rather than a vehicle built entirely around him. Val Kilmer reportedly told the production they could cut anything they wanted from his own dialogue, confident that his performance as Doc Holliday would stand out regardless of how much or how little screen time he had. Across the cast, most actors accepted these trims without much resistance. They had spent months working in brutal Arizona heat, and keeping the production alive and finishing the film mattered more to most of them than protecting every individual line they had originally been given. Almost everyone went along with the trimming process. Sam Elliott did not. Elliott had read Kevin Jarre's original unedited script before any of this chaos began, and by his own account, given in a 1993 interview with Entertainment Weekly while the film was still fresh in his mind, he considered it one of the finest screenplays he had ever encountered. He has said, in that same period, that if he had been handed the shortened version of the script, the one that ultimately became the movie audiences saw, he likely would have turned the project down entirely. That is a remarkable thing for an actor to say about a film that would go on to become one of the most beloved westerns of its generation, and it reveals exactly how much weight he placed on what was written into those original pages. According to people connected to the production, as writer John Fasano worked to trim the script down to a workable length, Elliott made his position on his own dialogue unmistakably clear, warning in blunt terms that he would not accept the same treatment his fellow cast members were quietly accepting. This was not simply an actor being difficult for the sake of it. Sam Elliott's character, Virgil Earp, was one of the roles most affected by the overall trimming of the script. In Jarre's fuller version, Virgil was written as the true moral center of the Earp family, the brother whose sense of duty and conviction is what eventually pulls the others back into wearing badges and standing up to the cowboys. A great deal of the quieter, more patient material that built out that side of Virgil's character, the connective scenes that gave his sense of justice real weight before the gunfights began, were exactly the kind of content that tends to get cut first when a production is racing against a shrinking budget and a collapsing schedule. So when Elliott drew a hard line over his own dialogue, he was not defending vanity or ego. He was defending the version of his character that had made him want to take the role in the first place, and by extension, defending a piece of the richer, more layered film that Jarre had originally envisioned. That quiet tension between Russell working to steer the production toward something leaner and more commercially viable, and Elliott fighting to preserve as much of Jarre's fuller, more patient vision as he personally could, runs underneath the entire finished film even though most audiences watching it today have no idea it exists. And here is what makes this story even more compelling. Elliott was not the only person connected to Tombstone who came to believe the finished film represented only a fraction of what it could have been. In that same 2006 interview, Kurt Russell himself described Jarre's original unedited script as being closer in scope and depth to something like The Godfather, reimagined as a Western. Stephen Lang, who played Ike Clanton in the finished film, has separately echoed a similar sentiment about the original material, describing it in comparably ambitious terms. These are not outside critics speculating from a distance. These are the very people who made the cuts, and they are the ones telling us decades later what they believe was lost in the process. Russell has continued to revisit this sense of unfinished business well into recent years. In more recent interviews, he has said that he has never fully made peace with how the production unfolded, and that he genuinely believes the film could have been even stronger than the version that was ultimately released. He has also mentioned that a substantial amount of unused footage from the original production is still believed to exist somewhere, and for years fans of the film have hoped for some kind of extended or restored cut that would bring more of Jarre's original vision back into the finished product. Whether that ever actually happens remains uncertain, but the simple fact that the people who made Tombstone are still talking about the version that got away more than 30 years later says a great deal about how strongly they believed in what was left on the cutting room floor. Once you understand just how fragile this production really was, it becomes clear how many near misses shaped the film audiences eventually received. The role of Doc Holliday, the performance that turned Val Kilmer into a legend, was reportedly considered for Willem Dafoe earlier in the process, before studio hesitation tied to controversy surrounding one of Dafoe's earlier films made that casting choice unlikely. At another point in the production's development, there were even discussions about a dramatically different pairing at the center of the film, with one version of events suggesting Kurt Russell was asked whether he might consider playing Doc Holliday instead of Wyatt Earp, with another actor stepping into the lead role. Had that version of the casting gone forward, the entire chemistry that Russell would later fight so hard to protect during editing might never have existed at all. The production also faced outside pressure during filming. At the exact same time Tombstone was being made, a competing Wyatt Earp film starring Kevin Costner was also in development, and the two productions became something of an informal rivalry within the industry, with reports suggesting that resources like authentic period costuming became harder for the Tombstone team to source because of competition between the two projects. Despite the fired director, the secretly reassigned creative control, the heavily trimmed script, and the external competition, Tombstone survived all of it and reached theaters that Christmas in 1993. It went on to become one of the highest-grossing westerns of the modern era, while Costner's competing film underperformed by comparison. The leaner, faster version of the story that Sam Elliott had fought against is, by most measures, exactly what allowed the film to connect so strongly with audiences. So who was actually right in that quiet, behind-the-scenes disagreement? Was it Sam Elliott who fought to preserve the richer, more patient, more expansive version of the story? Or was it Kurt Russell who cut the film down to its emotional core to make sure it could actually be finished and released? The honest answer is that both instincts mattered and both men were right in their own way. Russell's edits gave the finished film the momentum, the focus, and the quotability that turned it into the kind of movie people return to again and again, built around a central friendship that lands with real emotional force precisely because so much else was stripped away around it. But Elliott's instinct was not wrong either. He had read the fuller version of the story before any of the cuts happened, and he understood exactly what was being sacrificed, the slower, more human material that would have given Virgil and the rest of the Earp family even greater depth before the violence began. The Tombstone that exists today is a tight, thrilling piece of filmmaking, and it earned that reputation largely because of the difficult, often painful decisions Russell made under pressure. But it is also, by the admission of the very people who made it, only a fragment of something larger that never fully made it to the screen. That is the part of this story most fans of the film have never quite pieced together. Sam Elliott was not simply an actor delivering memorable lines as Virgil Earp. On that set, during one of the most chaotic productions of its era, he was the one person who looked closely at what was being lost and refused to let it disappear without saying something about it. He held on to the words he had left, because he understood exactly what they represented. A richer, slower, more ambitious version of this story that several of the people who made Tombstone still think about to this day. Every line that survived the editing process made it into a film that became a genuine classic, but somewhere behind that finished product is the version Sam Elliott read first, the one he believed in strongly enough to draw a hard line over, and the one that, by most accounts, still exists only in notes, memories and reels of footage that have never been seen by the public. That is the real story hiding behind one of the most quoted westerns ever made, and it is exactly why Sam Elliott's stubbornness on that set deserves to be remembered as much as anything he ever said in front of the camera.